Imagine a kitchen, the heart of a home, filled with the comforting aroma of simmering porridge, the gentle bubbling of the pot, the steam rising in soft clouds, the warmth that spreads through the room. These are the familiar sensations of nourishment and safety. Now imagine that simple meal, a symbol of sustenance and warmth, transformed into an instrument of agonizing death. This was the chilling reality of Tudor England under King Henry VIII, where fear brewed in every pot, and the kitchen could become a courtroom where the sentence was a slow, searing descent into a boiling cauldron. In the blood-soaked annals of English history, few punishments were as horrifying as being boiled alive. This was not the random barbarity of a distant, unenlightened past. It was a calculated act of state-sanctioned terror, codified into law by a king whose paranoia was as vast as his power. King Henry VIII, a monarch whose reign is forever etched in our collective memory for his 6 wives and the English Reformation, was also the architect of some of the most brutal punishments ever devised in the kingdom. He transformed execution into a form of public theater, a grotesque spectacle designed to instill absolute fear and obedience in his subjects. This story delves into one of the darkest and most disturbing chapters of Henry's reign, the short-lived but unforgettable law that made boiling alive the official punishment for poisoners. We will explore the political and personal anxieties that gave birth to this law, a piece of legislation so extreme it was used only twice in English history. We will bring to light the tragic stories of the 2 souls who met their end in the bubbling cauldrons of Smithfield. Richard Roose, a cook whose life was shattered by a single act of alleged malice, and Margaret Davy, a young servant girl whose fate became a whispered cautionary tale in Tudor households. Their stories are more than just gruesome anecdotes from a bygone era. They are a stark reminder of the terrifying intersection of absolute power and profound fear, of how a monarch's paranoia can become the law of the land, and how human beings can be reduced to mere instruments in a macabre political drama. We will journey back to the Tudor court, a world of whispered conspiracies and public executions, where the humble act of preparing food could lead to a death sentence of unimaginable agony. This is the story of Henry VIII's boiling law, a testament to the depths of human cruelty and the enduring struggle for justice and mercy in the face of absolute power. To understand the sheer brutality of the boiling law, one must first understand the man who conceived it and the tumultuous era in which he reigned. King Henry VIII was a monarch of contradictions, a charismatic and learned prince in his youth who became a bloated, tyrannical king in his later years. His reign, 1509 to 1547, was a period of profound change and instability, a maelstrom of religious upheaval, political intrigue, and personal drama that left an indelible mark on England. Henry's paranoia was not entirely unfounded. He ascended to the throne in a kingdom still haunted by the memory of the Wars of the Roses, a brutal civil war that had torn England apart for decades. The Tudor dynasty was relatively new, and its claim to the throne was not universally accepted. Henry was obsessed with securing his lineage, a desire that would famously lead him to break with the Roman Catholic Church and marry 6 times in his quest for a male heir. This break with Rome in the 1530s, known as the English Reformation, plunged the country into religious turmoil. It made Henry the head of the newly formed Church of England, but it also made him a heretic in the eyes of Catholic Europe and a target for assassination. The Pope excommunicated him, and Catholic powers like Spain and France saw him as a legitimate target for removal. Plots against his life, both real and imagined, were a constant source of anxiety for the king. In this climate of fear, poison was the ultimate nightmare. Unlike a sword or an arrow, poison was a silent, insidious killer. It could be administered by anyone, from a trusted servant to a disgruntled courtier. In a world without modern forensic science, it was almost impossible to detect, and its effects could mimic natural illnesses, making it the perfect weapon for a secret enemy. The Tudor court, with its elaborate banquets and armies of servants, was a fertile ground for such fears to fester. Every meal served to the king was a potential threat, every cup of wine a possible vessel of death. To protect himself, Henry VIII employed a small army of food tasters, known as yeomen of the mouth. These men had the unenviable job of sampling every dish and drink before it reached the king's lips. Their own lives were a constant gamble. If the king was poisoned, they would be the first to suffer the consequences. The royal kitchens were not just places of culinary artistry. They were fortresses, with strict protocols and constant surveillance to prevent any unauthorized person from accessing the king's food. It was against this backdrop of pervasive paranoia that a shocking incident occurred in February 1531. In the household of Bishop John Fisher of Rochester, a prominent and respected clergyman, several guests and members of the household fell violently ill after eating a meal of porridge. 2 people died from the poisoning, and many others were left severely sick. Bishop Fisher, a staunch opponent of Henry's divorce from Catherine of Aragon, and a man who would later be executed for his Catholic faith, was the likely target. While Fisher himself did not eat the poisoned porridge, the incident sent shockwaves through the kingdom and directly into the heart of the paranoid king. If a bishop could be targeted in his own home, what hope was there for the king? Henry's reaction was swift and brutal. He saw this act not as a simple murder, but as an act of treason, a direct threat to the social order and, by extension, to his own authority. He was determined to make an example of the culprit, to create a punishment so terrifying that no one would ever dare to use poison again. The man accused of the crime was Richard Roose, a cook in Bishop Fisher's household. Roose was arrested and, under interrogation, confessed to putting a white powder into the porridge. He claimed, however, that he had only intended to make the diners sick as a cruel joke, not to kill them. But Henry VIII was not interested in jokes. He saw an opportunity to unleash the full force of his power and to create a new law that would reflect the heinousness of the crime of poisoning. In 1531, he pushed a bill through Parliament that would become known as the Poisoners' Act. This act was unprecedented in its cruelty. It declared that poisoning was now an act of high treason, and that the punishment for it would be death by boiling. The law was specific. The convicted poisoner was to be put in a cauldron of boiling water, there to be boiled to death without any benefit of clergy. The benefit of clergy was a medieval legal loophole that allowed clergymen, and later anyone who could read, to be tried in more lenient ecclesiastical courts. By denying this benefit, Henry was ensuring that there would be no escape from the full horror of the sentence. The law was also retroactive, meaning it could be applied to crimes committed before it was passed. This was a clear violation of legal principles, but it was necessary for Henry to apply the new punishment to Richard Roose. Roose was convicted not by a jury of his peers in a regular court of law, but by an act of attainder, a legislative act that declared a person guilty of a crime without a trial. This was a tool often used by Henry to deal with his political enemies, and its application to a common cook showed just how seriously the king took the threat of poison. The Poisoners' Act was a reflection of Henry VIII's increasingly autocratic and brutal style of rule. It was a law born of fear, a monarch's desperate attempt to control a world he saw as filled with hidden dangers. The boiling cauldron was not just a method of execution. It was a symbol of the king's absolute power and his willingness to use unimaginable cruelty to maintain it. For the unfortunate souls who would be its victims, it would mean a slow, agonizing death, a public spectacle designed to be a terrifying warning to all who dared to challenge the king's authority. Richard Roose, a humble cook, could never have imagined that his name would be etched into the darkest corners of English history. He was an ordinary man, living an ordinary life in the service of a powerful and respected figure, Bishop John Fisher. The bishop's household was a world of routine and hierarchy, where Roose's days were spent in the heat of the kitchens, preparing meals for the bishop and his guests. It was a life of hard work, but also one of security and stability, a far cry from the horrors that awaited him. The fateful day was February 18, 1531. In the bishop's palace in Lambeth, a large pot of porridge was simmering on the fire, a simple meal for the household and for the poor who came to the bishop's gate for charity. But this was no ordinary meal. A white powder had been secretly added to the pot, a substance that would soon unleash a wave of agony and death. As the members of the household and the charity seekers ate the porridge, they began to fall violently ill. The symptoms were horrific: intense stomach pains, uncontrollable vomiting, and convulsions. Panic and chaos erupted in the bishop's palace. 2 people died in excruciating pain, and many others were left writhing in agony. Suspicion immediately fell on the kitchen staff, and Richard Roose was quickly identified as the prime suspect. He was arrested and taken to the Tower of London for interrogation. Under the immense pressure of Tudor interrogation methods, which often involved psychological and physical torment, Roose confessed. His confession, however, was a curious one. He admitted to putting the powder in the porridge, but he insisted that he had no intention of killing anyone. He claimed that he thought the powder was a purgative, a substance that would cause digestive upset, and that he had done it as a joke, a foolish prank that had gone horribly wrong. Whether Roose's confession was genuine or a desperate attempt to save himself from a worse fate, we will never know. The truth of what happened in Bishop Fisher's kitchen on that day is lost to the mists of time. Some historians have speculated that Roose was a pawn in a larger political game, perhaps hired by enemies of Bishop Fisher to discredit or even assassinate the outspoken clergyman. Fisher was a vocal critic of King Henry VIII's desire to divorce Catherine of Aragon, and his opposition had made him a powerful enemy of the crown. A poisoning attempt in his household could have been a warning or a failed assassination attempt. But for King Henry VIII, the details of Roose's motives were irrelevant. The king was convinced that this was a deliberate act of poisoning, a crime of the most treacherous kind. He saw it as a direct threat to his own safety and the stability of his kingdom. He was determined to make an example of Richard Roose, and he would not let the lack of a clear motive or a formal trial stand in his way. Instead of a trial by jury, Roose was condemned by an act of attainder. This was a parliamentary decree that declared a person guilty of a crime, usually treason, without the need for a trial. It was a powerful tool of political oppression, and Henry used it frequently to eliminate his enemies. The fact that he used it against a common cook speaks volumes about the level of his paranoia. The day of Richard Roose's execution, April 5, 1531, was a day of grim spectacle at Smithfield, a public space in London that was notorious for its executions. A large crowd gathered to witness the unprecedented punishment that had been decreed by the king. In the center of the square stood a large iron cauldron, filled with water, with a fire blazing beneath it. Richard Roose was brought to the scaffold in chains. A contemporary chronicler described the scene in vivid detail. Roose was not given the mercy of a quick death. He was to be boiled alive, a slow and agonizing process designed to inflict the maximum amount of suffering. The executioner chained him and lowered him into the cauldron while the water was still cold. Then the fire was stoked, and the water began to heat up slowly. The crowd watched in horrified silence as the water temperature rose. Roose's screams of agony would have echoed across the square as the water began to scald his skin. The process was deliberately slow, designed to prolong his suffering for as long as possible. It was a terrifying spectacle, a public display of the king's wrath. The execution took hours. Roose was reportedly raised and lowered into the boiling water several times, a gruesome detail that underscores the calculated cruelty of the punishment. Finally, After what must have felt like an eternity of unimaginable pain, Richard Roose died. His execution was a chilling success in terms of its intended effect. The story of the cook who was boiled alive spread like wildfire throughout England. It became a cautionary tale, a stark warning of the consequences of challenging the king's authority. The memory of Richard Roose's agonizing death would linger in the public consciousness, a testament to the brutal justice of King Henry VIII. He was the first victim of the boiling law, a man whose life was sacrificed to feed a king's paranoia and to serve as a gruesome symbol of royal power. 10 years after the horrific execution of Richard Roose, the boiling cauldrons of Smithfield were prepared once again. The second and final victim of Henry VIII's brutal law was a young woman named Margaret Davy, a servant girl whose life was cut short by a tragedy that mirrored the case of Richard Roose in its cruelty, but differed in its personal and perhaps more pathetic nature. Margaret Davy's story is less well documented than that of Richard Roose. She was not connected to a high-profile figure like a bishop, and her case did not have the same political undertones. She was a young, vulnerable woman, a domestic servant in a London household, a position that placed her at the mercy of her employers and the rigid social hierarchy of Tudor England. For young women of her class, domestic service was one of the few options for employment. It was a life of long hours, hard labor, and little freedom. In March 1542, tragedy struck the household where Margaret worked. Her mistress and 2 other people fell ill after a meal, and it was soon determined that they had been poisoned. Suspicion quickly fell on Margaret Davy. The details of the investigation are scant, but it is likely that she was subjected to the same coercive interrogation methods that had been used on Richard Roose. Under such duress, it is not surprising that she confessed to the crime. Her alleged motive, however, was not political intrigue or a prank gone wrong. It was a story of personal desperation. It is said that Margaret poisoned her employers in order to be free to marry a man she loved, a man her mistress disapproved of. This was a crime of passion, of a young woman trapped in a world that offered her little control over her own destiny. While her actions were undoubtedly criminal, her story paints a poignant picture of the limited choices and the harsh realities faced by women in Tudor society. Unlike Richard Roose, Margaret Davy was not convicted by an act of attainder. She was tried and found guilty in a court of law. However, the outcome was the same. The Poisoners' Act of 1531 was still in effect, and the sentence for poisoning was death by boiling. On March 17, 1542, Margaret Davy was taken to Smithfield to face her agonizing fate. The scene of her execution was a grim echo of Richard Roose's death a decade earlier. The cauldron, the fire, the chains, the expectant crowd all were in place for another public display of royal justice. Margaret, a young woman, was brought before the crowd, her face filled with terror. She was chained and lowered into the cold water, and the fire was lit. The chroniclers of the time described the crowd's reaction to Margaret's execution. There was a palpable sense of unease and revulsion. The spectacle of a young woman being slowly boiled to death was too much for many to bear. Unlike the execution of Richard Roose, which had been met with a mixture of horror and a grim sense of justice being served, Margaret's execution seems to have elicited a wave of pity and disgust. Several contemporary accounts mention that many in the crowd turned away, unable to watch the gruesome spectacle. Pregnant women reportedly fainted and had to be carried away. Margaret Davy's death was a turning point. While the boiling law had been intended to be a powerful deterrent, the public reaction to her execution suggested that it had crossed a line. The punishment was seen as excessively cruel, especially when applied to a young woman whose crime, while heinous, stemmed from personal desperation rather than political treason. The spectacle had become too horrific, too inhumane, even for the hardened sensibilities of Tudor England. The cases of Richard Roose and Margaret Davy, though separated by a decade, are inextricably linked. They are the only two people known to have been executed under the boiling law. Both were from the lower classes of society, a cook and a servant, people with little power or influence. Both were convicted of poisoning, a crime that terrified the Tudor elite. Both suffered an unimaginably cruel death in the public square. Their stories highlight the stark realities of Tudor justice, a system where the law could be used as an instrument of terror, where the paranoia of the king could lead to the creation of barbaric punishments, and where the lives of ordinary people could be sacrificed for the sake of a political message. The fates of Richard Roose and Margaret Davy are a chilling reminder of the dark side of Henry VIII's reign, a reign that was as much about brutal repression as it was about grand political and religious change. The boiling law of Henry VIII stands as a singular monument to the cruelty of his reign. Its lifespan was remarkably short, lasting only 16 years, and its application was exceedingly rare. Yet, its legacy endured, casting a long, dark shadow over the history of English law and serving as a potent symbol of the excesses of absolute monarchy. The repeal of the boiling law in 1547, shortly after Henry VIII's death and the ascension of his young son, Edward VI, was a clear rejection of the old king's brutality. The new Protestant regime, led by a regency council, was keen to distance itself from the more tyrannical aspects of Henry's rule. The repeal was part of a broader wave of legal reforms aimed at creating a more just and humane legal system. The fact that the boiling law was one of the first to be abolished speaks volumes about its unpopularity. The public revulsion that had been so evident at the execution of Margaret Davy had clearly made an impression on the ruling elite. The punishment was simply too barbaric, too far outside the bounds of what was considered acceptable, even in an age accustomed to public violence. The spectacle had backfired. Instead of instilling fear and obedience, it had provoked pity and disgust, undermining the very authority it was meant to uphold. The symbolism of boiling alive was also a factor in its demise. Boiling was a punishment that resonated with deep-seated cultural anxieties. It was a form of death that was both slow and demeaning, a complete annihilation of the body. It was seen as a punishment that was not just about retribution, but about purification, a way of cleansing the body politic of the taint of treason. However, the very theatricality of the punishment, its deliberate and prolonged cruelty, ultimately made it unsustainable. It was a spectacle of horror that even the most hardened Londoners could not stomach. The psychological impact of these executions on Tudor society was profound. The stories of Richard Roose and Margaret Davy were not quickly forgotten. They were passed down through generations, becoming part of the folklore of London. They served as a constant reminder of the dark potential of unchecked power, of what can happen when a monarch's fear is allowed to dictate the law. The legacy of the boiling law can also be seen in the subsequent development of English law. The experience of Henry VIII's reign, with its arbitrary and often brutal application of justice, led to a growing demand for legal reforms that would protect the rights of individuals against the power of the state. The idea of due process, of a fair trial, of punishments that were proportionate to the crime, all of these concepts gained traction in the years following Henry's death, partly as a reaction to the excesses of his reign. The boiling law, in its very extremity, helped to define the limits of acceptable punishment. It became a byword for barbarity, a cautionary tale that was used by legal reformers for centuries to argue for a more humane and rational system of justice. The names of Richard Roose and Margaret Davy, though often forgotten in the grand sweep of history, are a testament to the human cost of political paranoia and the enduring power of conscience to resist even the most absolute of tyrants. In the end, Henry VIII's boiling law was a failure. It failed to deter the crime of poisoning, it failed to enhance the king's authority, and it ultimately failed to win the hearts and minds of his people. It was a brief, brutal experiment in terror that left a lasting stain on the reputation of a king who was already notorious for his cruelty. The story of those who were boiled alive is a chilling reminder of the dark side of human nature, but it is also a story of hope, a story of how even in the darkest of times, the human spirit can resist and ultimately overcome the forces of tyranny and injustice. The flames that roared beneath the cauldrons at Smithfield have long since been extinguished. The screams of Richard Roose and Margaret Davy have faded into the silence of history, but the echoes of their suffering and the story of the law that condemned them to such a horrific fate still resonate today. Henry VIII's boiling law was a brief and brutal chapter in the long and often bloody history of English justice. It was a law born of a king's paranoia, a desperate and ultimately futile attempt to control a world he saw as filled with hidden dangers. It was a law that pushed the boundaries of cruelty, that transformed a mundane kitchen utensil into an instrument of unimaginable terror. The stories of Richard Roose and Margaret Davy are a stark reminder of the human cost of absolute power. They were ordinary people, caught in the crossfire of a king's fears and ambitions. Their lives were sacrificed for the sake of a political message, their deaths a gruesome spectacle designed to instill fear and obedience. But in the end, their suffering did not go unnoticed. The public revulsion that their executions provoked helped to spark a movement for legal reform, a movement that would ultimately lead to a more humane and just system of law. The legacy of the boiling law is a complex one. It is a story of tyranny and cruelty, but it is also a story of resistance and resilience. It is a reminder that even in the darkest of times, the human conscience can be a powerful force for change. The story of those who were boiled alive is a cautionary tale, a warning against the dangers of unchecked power and the seductive allure of fear-based politics. As we look back on this dark chapter of history, we are reminded that the struggle for justice and human dignity is a constant one. The principles of due process, of fair and proportionate punishment, of the sanctity of human life, these are not given, they are hard-won. The story of Henry VIII's boiling law is a powerful reminder of why we must always be vigilant in defending these principles, why we must never allow fear to dictate the course of justice, and why we must never forget the lessons of the past, lest we be condemned to repeat them. The screams from the cauldron at Smithfield may be silent now, but their echoes should continue to haunt our conscience, urging us to build a world where such horrors are never again imagined, let alone enacted. Thank you for watching Silent Atrocities. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you want more absolutely insane historical content that your teachers were too polite to mention, hit that subscribe button right now, share and comment below. See you in the next one.